The twin moons of Sirith 7 cast a pale, shimmering glow over the towering spires of Grand Nexus, the heart of the Cirithian civilization. From above, the city looked like a living organism, its crystalline bridges pulsing with energy as citizens moved in synchronized precision. Their minds were seamlessly connected, forming a vast, collective consciousness, a silent symphony of thoughts that hummed through the very fabric of the air. For most, this connection was as natural as breathing. To exist outside it was unthinkable. To be severed from it, unforgivable. Ava Kellen knew this better than anyone. She stood in the shadow of a monolithic structure, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, watching the crowds move with effortless unity. Their thoughts flowed through one another, a seamless exchange of ideas, emotions, and intent. But she heard nothing. Felt nothing. Ava had been born without the ability to link. A defect. An aberration. A mistake. She had spent her life being reminded of this. The way others would subtly shift away from her presence, their telepathic ripples recoiling as if her very existence disrupted the harmony of their world. The way her parents, though kind, had spoken in soft, pitying tones, always glancing at her with a sadness she wished she could unsee. The way the High Council never acknowledged her, as if ignoring her existence might erase the failure she represented. And yet, despite everything, a quiet, stubborn part of her still longed to belong. The sudden hush that fell over the plaza pulled Ava from her thoughts. A ripple of unease passed through the crowd as a figure stepped into view, tall, broad-shouldered, and unmistakably foreign. The man moved with an easy confidence, but even from a distance, Ava could tell that he was out of place. The cut of his uniform was different, his movements just slightly off from the graceful fluidity of the Cirithian people. Most damning of all, he walked alone, untethered, unlinked, his thoughts silent to those around him. A human. Ava had heard whispers that an off-world diplomat was arriving, but she hadn't expected him to walk so brazenly into the heart of Grand Nexus. The reaction was immediate. Cirithians stiffened, their movements faltering as the ever-present psychic current in the air grew strained. They could not hear his thoughts, could not predict his intent. He was unpredictable, uncontrollable, dangerous. The stranger didn't seem to notice, or more likely didn't care. His gaze swept over the gathered crowd, assessing, unreadable. Then, to Ava's utter disbelief, he smiled. Hostile welcome, noted. The sound of his voice, spoken aloud, sent another ripple of discomfort through the plaza. Cirithians rarely spoke with words, not when thought could carry so much more nuance, so much more precision. Words were crude, inefficient, and yet he wielded them effortlessly, like a weapon he had long since mastered. Ava should have looked away, should have retreated before someone noticed she was staring. But for the first time in years, she found herself transfixed, because she recognized the look in his eyes. Not fear, not arrogance, but something else. Something she saw every time she caught her own reflection in the glass towers of Grand Nexus. Loneliness. The man's gaze drifted, scanning the crowd with casual detachment, until his eyes locked onto hers. For a fraction of a second, Ava considered stepping back. But she didn't. She held his stare. A slow grin tugged at the corner of his lips, as if he found her defiance amusing. And then, in a move that sent a shockwave through the already tense crowd, he walked straight toward her. Ava's breath caught in her throat. She didn't move as he closed the distance between them, stopping just close enough that she could see the faintest hint of exhaustion beneath his confident exterior. He shoved his hands into the pockets of his flight jacket, tilting his head slightly. You look like you're about 5 seconds away from either attacking someone or running for the nearest exit. Thought I'd say hi before you made up your mind? Ava stared at him. The whispers around them intensified, minds brushing against one another in alarm. She couldn't hear their words, but she could feel their intent. She knew exactly what they were saying. Why is he speaking? Why is she engaging with him? Why doesn't she send him away? Ava clenched her fists. You're making a scene, she muttered, barely moving her lips. The man, Carter Hayes, if she remembered the diplomatic reports correctly, chuckled. "You say that like I started it." He gestured vaguely at the crowd. "Pretty sure they were already freaked out before I opened my mouth." She exhaled sharply through her nose, resisting the urge to glance toward the towering High Council chamber looming at the far end of the plaza. They were watching. She could feel it. "You shouldn't be here," she warned. Carter raised a brow. "Funny. I was about to say the same thing about you." The words struck harder than she wanted them to. Before Ava could form a retort, a subtle shift in the air sent a chill down her spine. The psychic current of Grand Nexus pulsed, like a great tide withdrawing before a storm. The High Council had taken notice. The air inside the High Council chamber was heavy with an oppressive silence, the kind that settled into the bones like an unspoken command. Ava had been in this room before, but never like this. Never with the full weight of the Council's scrutiny bearing down on her, eyes as cold and unfeeling as the crystal walls that surrounded them. She stood at the center of the circular hall, bathed in the ethereal glow of the floating prisms that lined the chamber's ceiling, their light shifting in muted pulses, a visual representation of the Council's collective thoughts. She had always imagined this moment differently. If she had ever dared to dream of standing before the High Council, she would have envisioned herself victorious, having somehow proven that her defect did not make her lesser, that she had worth, that she belonged. But reality had a cruel way of stripping away illusions. Across from her, Carter stood with his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket, his posture deceptively relaxed, but she knew better. He wasn't the kind to be intimidated easily, but even he wasn't immune to the suffocating weight of the Council's presence. His gaze flicked to her once, just briefly, before returning to the imposing figure seated on the highest platform before them. Thane Varys. The High Councilor's expression was unreadable, carved from years of absolute control and discipline. He observed them for a long moment, and though he did not speak, Ava knew he was already weaving his thoughts through the collective mind of the other council members, their silent deliberation taking place beyond her reach. Finally, his voice cut through the silence, sharp and measured. "You have lived like a shadow long enough, Ava Kellen. This is your last opportunity to prove that your existence serves a purpose." Ava felt her throat tighten, but she refused to look away. She had spent her entire life being ignored, overlooked, reduced to nothing more than an anomaly to be pitied or cast aside. Now, for the first time, they were addressing her directly. She should have felt relief. Instead, all she felt was the sickening weight of inevitability. "You want me to prove myself?" Her voice did not waver, though every part of her wanted to recoil. "What is it you expect me to do?" Varys's gaze darkened. "You will form a neural link with the human," he stated, his tone carrying no room for debate. Ava stiffened. Her first instinct was to deny it outright, to argue that such a thing was impossible, that the very nature of their minds made it absurd to even attempt such an experiment. But she did not say any of those things, because she knew, deep down, that the Council did not make idle requests. This was not a suggestion. Carter let out a low whistle beside her, his smirk laced with something more than amusement. "Let me get this straight," he said, rocking back on his heels. "You're asking me to voluntarily link minds with someone who, correct me if I'm wrong, has never successfully bonded with a single soul in her entire life?" A murmur of displeasure rippled through the chamber, though no words were spoken. "You misunderstand," Thane Varys said, his voice cool, controlled. "This is not a request." Ava's hands clenched into fists. "And if I refuse?" she asked, already knowing she would not like the answer. Varys turned his gaze to Carter. "Then the human will no longer be a free agent under diplomatic protection," he said simply. "He will be placed under our jurisdiction, studied, contained." Carter's smirk disappeared. Ava's pulse spiked, her mind racing. This had never been about giving her a choice. The Council had already decided that she was expendable. She could either comply, or they would turn their focus to Carter instead. Her stomach twisted. She knew what happened to those who became subjects of the Council's experiments. Carter, however, seemed utterly unfazed. "Right. Because locking me up has worked out so well for everyone else who's tried it, he said, glancing around. You do know humans aren't exactly wired the way you are, right? Neural link or not, my thoughts aren't exactly neat little packets of information. If anything, they're probably going to short-circuit your entire system. Varys did not acknowledge the remark. His focus remained solely on Ava. The choice is yours, he said, though they all knew it was not. Ava's breath came shallow and slow. She had spent her entire life being told she was nothing, that she was an empty void where a mind should be. And now, suddenly, she was of interest to them. Number. She was not their experiment. But Carter. Ava exhaled sharply, forcing the whirlwind of emotions aside. She could feel Carter watching her, waiting for her decision, but he said nothing. He did not try to persuade her one way or the other, and that somehow made it worse. It meant he was leaving the choice to her. It meant he trusted her to make the right call. Her voice was quiet when she finally spoke. I'll do it. A flicker of approval passed through the council, though it was not relief she felt. Only the tightening sensation of a noose drawing closed. Varys nodded once. Then it is decided. The council's decision was final. The discussion concluded. Guards stepped forward, motioning for them to be escorted out of the chamber. But just as Ava turned to follow, she caught movement from the shadows. A figure had been watching the entire exchange, standing near the far end of the room, partially obscured by the cascading light of the prisms above. Kyle Soren. For a moment, he did not move. His eyes met hers, and something unspoken passed between them. A hesitation. A flicker of something almost like regret. Then, just as quickly, he looked away. Ava felt a chill settle over her. Kale had once been her closest friend. He had been the only one who hadn't treated her like she was broken. The only one who had stood beside her, defended her, refused to let the whispers of their people define her. And then, one day, he had turned his back on her. She had not spoken to him in years. Yet here he was, lurking in the shadows of the council chamber, watching her like a ghost from another life. Something about it set her on edge. Because if there was one thing she had learned in all her years of being an outcast, it was that ghosts did not return without a reason. And Kale Soren had always been very, very good at keeping secrets. As she and Carter were led from the chamber, her thoughts were no longer on the experiment. They were on the man she once trusted. And whether or not he had just become their greatest enemy. The room was sterile, almost unnervingly so. The walls, a smooth obsidian black, pulsed with thin veins of cyan light, reacting to the quiet hum of the neural interface machine embedded in the center of the chamber. Ava stood beside it, her hands curled into fists at her sides. She could feel the weight of a dozen unseen eyes watching from beyond the darkened observation glass, the High Council monitoring her every breath, every flicker of hesitation. She was being tested. Again. Carter, standing a few feet away, let out a low breath. I'm getting the feeling your people don't do cozy. His voice was the only sound in the room besides the soft mechanical hum of the machine. He hadn't been restrained, hadn't been forced into compliance, but the unspoken threat hung in the air between them. If he refused, if she refused, the consequences would be far worse. Ava turned her gaze to him, and for the briefest moment, she considered warning him, telling him that this was not some simple experiment, that the High Council wasn't looking for success, they were looking for control. But it was too late. The machine activated, sending a pulse of energy rippling through the floor. Ava sucked in a breath as her senses were suddenly pulled in every direction, as if she had been dropped into a churning sea with no shore in sight. Her knees almost buckled under the force of it, but she gritted her teeth, forcing herself to stay upright. And then Carter's mind hit her like a violent storm. Ava staggered, her breath ripping from her lungs as her consciousness was yanked into something vast, erratic, and overwhelmingly loud. She had expected chaos. But this was something else entirely. Thoughts, emotions, fragmented memories crashed into her in rapid succession. A child's laughter, echoing in a small home filled with warmth. The suffocating weight of isolation in the endless dark of space. A sudden, sharp burst of fear. Gunfire. A ship falling apart. The taste of iron in his mouth. And beneath it all, the relentless hum of a restless mind, jumping from one thought to the next before any of them could fully settle. Ava clenched her hands, trying to steady herself, trying to breathe. Then Carter's voice, sharp and bewildered, cut through the noise. "Okay, what the hell was that?" She could feel his confusion, his discomfort. His mind wasn't meant to be read, wasn't meant to be laid bare like this. Unlike the Cerithians, whose thoughts were structured, synchronized, Carter's mind was like a wildfire, unpredictable and untamed. He was fighting against the connection. Ava's own consciousness reeled from the intensity of it. For so long, she had been cut off from others, forced to exist in silence while everyone around her shared thoughts as effortlessly as breathing. And now, for the first time, she was hearing, no, feeling, someone else. And it was unbearable. Her breath hitched as another wave of emotion slammed into her. But this time, it wasn't Carter's. It was her own. Or rather, it was Carter feeling what she felt. A crushing, hollow emptiness. A lifetime of existing just outside of something she could never touch. The quiet, aching knowledge that no matter how hard she tried, no matter how much she wanted it, she would never belong. Carter swore under his breath. Ava barely managed to blink before she felt something shift. A pull, gentle at first, then insistent. Carter was trying to pull away, trying to sever the link before it went too deep, but the machine wasn't designed for that. Once a connection was established, it would only grow stronger. And it did. Memories bled into each other, past and present intertwining in a mess of thoughts that didn't belong to either of them alone. She saw herself through Carter's eyes. The moment he had first seen her in the plaza, the way she had stood apart from the others, watching the world move without her. He had recognized it, the loneliness, because he had known it too. She saw Carter through his own memories, moving from station to station, never staying long enough to call anywhere home. The people he had fought beside, the ones he had lost, the quiet moments, staring at the stars, pretending that drifting alone through the void was the same as freedom. It wasn't. Ava's pulse pounded in her ears. She needed to break away, needed to shut it down before... The world lurched. The room around them flickered in and out of focus, the connection spiraling out of control. The machine was failing. A sharp voice cut through the air, distant but unmistakable. "Terminate the link. Now." Thane Varys. Ava barely registered the command before the pain hit. A splitting, searing sensation in the back of her skull, like something was trying to pry her mind apart. She gasped, but the sound barely made it past her lips before her knees gave out. Carter caught her. She felt his hands on her arms, steadying her, grounding her. But it was more than that. She could still feel him, even as the machine flickered and the connection wavered. It hadn't broken. Even without the machine, something remained. "Ava!" Carter's voice was low, urgent. "Talk to me. Are you—" The door to the chamber burst open before he could finish. Guards. Ava struggled to stand, her head still spinning, but before she could move, another figure stepped into the room. Kyle. He didn't hesitate. He moved with swift, precise efficiency, reaching for the control panel, overriding the system before the guards could react. The lights flickered, alarms flaring to life. Then he turned to them. "Move," he said. Carter didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed Ava's wrist and pulled her forward, his grip firm but careful, as if he wasn't entirely sure she wouldn't collapse again. She barely had time to register the guards shouting before they were running, Kale leading them through a side passage, deeper into the facility. Ava's head was still pounding, her thoughts a tangled mess of emotions that weren't entirely her own. But one thing was clear. The link between her and Carter wasn't gone, and that terrified her more than anything. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder. The High Council would not let them go so easily, and Ava knew. This was only the beginning. The city pulsed with an eerie glow as Ava and Carter sprinted through the narrow corridors of the facility, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Behind them, the alarms wailed, a mechanical voice echoing through the halls, announcing their status as fugitives. The High Council's decision had been swift. Ava had long known she was an anomaly in their society, An outsider. Now, she was officially a traitor. Carter kept a firm grip on her wrist as they navigated the unfamiliar passages, his pace relentless. The sleek, sterile walls of the compound blurred as they moved, the artificial lighting casting long, distorted shadows. Ava's head was still throbbing from the failed experiment, her mind struggling to process the lingering fragments of Carter's thoughts that remained tethered to her own. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The neural connection should have severed the moment the machine shut down. But something had changed. Something irreversible. They emerged into a vast open chamber, the towering structures of Grand Nexus visible beyond the reinforced glass walls. Below them, the city was alive with movement. Thousands of Cerithians moving in synchronized perfection, completely unaware of the chaos unfolding within the Council's inner sanctum. But that would change soon. Carter yanked her to a stop beside a control panel, his chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. "They're gonna lock down the whole damn city if we don't move now," he muttered, his eyes scanning the interface before him. "There's gotta be a way out of here." Footsteps echoed down the corridor behind them. Ava turned, her pulse hammering. The High Council wouldn't send ordinary soldiers after them, not for something this important. No, they would unleash the enforcers, elite operatives enhanced by the very same neural technology that had deemed her a failure. If they were caught, there would be no trial, no discussion. They would simply disappear. Carter must have seen the look in her eyes because his jaw tightened. "We need an exit. Fast." Before she could respond, a familiar voice came from the shadows. "You're running out of time." Kale Soren stepped forward, his presence a sharp contrast against the cold, clinical environment. His dark uniform blended seamlessly with the dim lighting, but there was something different about his stance, tense, calculated, as if he was fighting some internal battle of his own. Ava stiffened. "Why are you helping us?" Kale's expression was unreadable. "Because you don't understand what you've just done. That connection between you two, it's not just an anomaly. It's a threat to the very foundation of our society." Carter let out a dry laugh. "Oh yeah? And what's the grand plan exactly? Hand us over and hope the Council forgives your little act of treason." Kale ignored him, his gaze fixed on Ava. "There's only one way you get out of this alive. A neural pulse device. It'll overload the city's collective consciousness, break the connection between every Cerithian within range." Ava's stomach clenched. "You mean disrupt the entire network?" Kale nodded. "It'll buy you enough time to escape, but it won't be selective. Everyone in the blast radius will be affected, including you." Carter exhaled sharply, stepping between them. "Yeah, that's not happening." "It's the only way," Kale insisted. "You won't outrun the enforcers. You won't outfight them. But if you take away their greatest advantage, their link, then they become just as blind as you are to them." Carter's hands curled into fists. Ava could feel his hesitation through the lingering connection between them, a storm of conflicting thoughts colliding inside his mind. He didn't trust Kale. He didn't trust anything about this. But then his gaze flicked to her, and something changed. She didn't speak, didn't argue. She simply met his eyes and waited. Carter let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair before muttering, "You better be right about this." Kale handed him a small, sleek device, no bigger than Carter's palm. 30 seconds after activation, no second chances. Carter took it, then turned to Ava. "If this thing knocks you out, what happens?" Ava hesitated. "I don't know." The uncertainty was enough to make him hesitate, his grip on the device tightening. "Go," Kale urged. "You're wasting time." Ava stepped closer to Carter, lowering her voice. "I trust you." Something flickered across his face, something she didn't have time to analyze before he nodded, pressing his thumb against the activation panel. The effect was immediate. A sharp, invisible wave burst outward, sending a pulse through the air that made Ava's skin prickle. The world seemed to lurch sideways as the very fabric of the Cerithian network began to unravel. All around them, the synchronized movements of the city stuttered, people faltering, clutching their heads as their once flawless mental link was severed. For the first time in generations, Grand Nexus was silent. The enforcers at the entrance stumbled, their precision momentarily shattered. Carter didn't hesitate. He grabbed Ava's hand and ran. The city was falling into chaos around them, but she barely registered it. The neural pulse had done more than sever the link. It had weakened her in ways she hadn't expected. Her knees buckled mid-stride, and Carter had to pull her upright, his grip the only thing keeping her moving. "Stay with me, Kellen," he muttered. Ava forced herself to push through the haze clouding her mind. She could still feel the remnants of the neural pulse reverberating inside her skull. But one thing was clear. They weren't out of this yet. The air around them crackled with unstable energy. The towering archway of the portal humming with power as it prepared to collapse. The escape route that had once seemed like a distant possibility was now their only hope. Beyond the shimmering gateway lay the unknown, a chance at survival, a future not dictated by the High Council. But there was one problem. The energy reserves of the portal had been drained during the chase. It could only send one person through. Ava barely had time to process the realization before Carter shoved her forward, his grip firm but desperate. "Go!" he shouted over the deafening roar of failing machinery. She dug her heels into the ground, resisting. "No!" she shot back, shaking her head. "You go first!" Carter let out a sharp breath, as if he had expected this, as if he already knew she would argue. "Not happening, Kellen." His voice was steady, but beneath the forced bravado she could hear something raw, something unspoken. The facility trembled around them, warning alarms flashing across the walls, but neither of them moved. Ava clenched her fists. "You'll be trapped if you stay." "And if you go, what happens to you?" Carter countered, stepping closer. His face was streaked with sweat, his breaths uneven, but his eyes never wavered. "You can barely stand. You're still recovering from that neural pulse. You think you're making it out of here alone?" She hated that he was right. The link between them, however fragile, still buzzed at the edges of her mind. She could feel his frustration, his resolve, but most of all, his fear. Not for himself. For her. The energy surrounding the portal flickered violently, its edges unstable. If they waited too long, neither of them would make it. Ava took a deep breath. "Then we go together." Carter hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. And then she saw it. The exact moment he made his decision. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist with a force that sent a shockwave of sensation through their fractured connection. Without another word, he pulled her forward, and together, they dove into the portal. The world around them disintegrated into pure light. Ava had read about portal travel before, how it felt like being unraveled at the atomic level, how it disoriented even the strongest of minds. But nothing could have prepared her for the sheer force of it. It was like being pulled apart and reassembled all at once. The connection between her and Carter flared, white-hot and overwhelming. For a split second, she could see everything. Fragments of his past, his emotions, the endless depths of space he had drifted through alone. And then pain. Something went wrong. Ava's vision blurred, her body screaming in protest as the force of the collapsing portal lashed against her. Carter's grip tightened. She barely registered his voice, distant and frantic, calling her name. Then, impact. They crashed onto cold, unforgiving ground. The world snapped back into place. But everything was wrong. The sky above them was dark, filled with swirling storm clouds tinged with an unnatural blue glow. The terrain stretched endlessly, metallic and lifeless, illuminated only by the faint remnants of the portal's energy flickering into nothingness behind them. They had made it through. But Ava wasn't moving. Carter scrambled upright, his pulse hammering as he turned to her. She lay sprawled across the ground, her breath shallow, her face pale. Blood seeped from a wound just beneath her ribs, staining the sleek fabric of her suit. Panic surged through him. "Ava!" he rasped, pressing his hands against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "Stay with me." Her eyelids fluttered, her lips parting slightly, but no words came out. Carter clenched his jaw. His heart was pounding too fast, his mind racing through solutions he didn't have. He had survived countless battles, dangerous missions, impossible odds. But this, watching her slip away, this was something he wasn't prepared for. "You don't get to do this," he muttered, shaking his head as he applied more pressure. "You don't get to fight this hard just to give up now." She exhaled shakily, her fingers twitching slightly against the ground. Slowly, painfully, her gaze met his. "I'm not giving up," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible, but the defiance in her eyes was unmistakable. Carter let out a rough, unsteady breath, his throat tightening. She was still here, and he wasn't going to let her go. "We're not done," he said, his voice softer now, but no less determined. "You hear me, Kellen? We're not done." Ava's lips curved just slightly, the barest hint of a smile ghosting across her face. "For the first time," she murmured, her fingers barely brushing against his. "I don't feel alone." Carter exhaled sharply, his grip tightening over her hand. "You never were," he whispered. "And you never will be." The storm rumbled in the distance, but neither of them moved. For the first time, there was no need to run. The wind howled across the barren landscape, carrying with it the scent of ionized air and the metallic tang of a storm on the horizon. The sky was a shifting tapestry of deep blues and purples, crackling with distant energy surges that lit up the jagged terrain in eerie flashes. They had escaped, but barely. And now, as Carter knelt beside Ava, pressing a hand against her wound, he knew their fight was far from over. Her breathing was uneven, each inhale shallow, strained. The portal had spat them out on the other side of the galaxy, or at least somewhere far enough that the air tasted unfamiliar, tinged with minerals that stung the back of his throat. The ground beneath them was cold, smooth like polished stone, stretching in every direction without any sign of civilization. Wherever they were, it was desolate. Carter glanced over his shoulder, scanning the horizon. There was no telling if the High Council had the capability to track them here, but if he had learned anything about powerful, oppressive regimes, it was that they never gave up on loose ends. And Ava? She wasn't just a loose end. She was proof that their system wasn't as perfect as they wanted to believe. A soft sound pulled his attention back to her. She was trying to push herself upright, her muscles trembling under the effort. He caught her before she could collapse again, steadying her against him. "Easy," he murmured, shifting to support her weight. "You're still bleeding, and I don't know what the hell this place does to injuries. Let's not rush to find out." Ava exhaled through her nose, her expression one of quiet determination despite the pain shadowing her features. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No argument there." Carter scanned their surroundings again, noting the jagged formations in the distance. They could provide cover, but not much else. "First, we need to figure out what's waiting for us on this rock." Ava's eyes flickered with something unreadable. It wasn't fear, not exactly. More like an instinct, a deep-seated sense that they hadn't landed here by accident. And then, as if the universe had decided to answer their unspoken question, a voice rang out from the shadows. "You survived." Carter's muscles tensed instantly, his hand reaching for the sidearm holstered at his hip. Ava stiffened beside him, but she didn't react with the same immediate hostility. No, her response was more complicated. Because she recognized the voice. Kyle stepped forward, emerging from the cover of a rocky outcrop like a ghost materializing from the darkness. His uniform was no longer pristine, dirt and ash smudging the once flawless fabric. His stance was relaxed, but there was a tension in his shoulders, a wariness that suggested he wasn't sure how this confrontation would unfold. Carter didn't lower his weapon. "How the hell did you get here?" Kale tilted his head slightly, his gaze flicking between them before settling on Ava. "I had to make sure you got out," he said simply. Ava's fingers curled against the fabric of Carter's jacket, a small but noticeable movement. He could feel the battle raging inside her. Kyle had betrayed her once, turned his back on her when it mattered most. And yet, here he was. Again. "You helped us escape," she said, her voice carefully measured. "Why?" Kale let out a slow breath, his expression unreadable. Because I realized too late what they were willing to do. He paused, as if weighing his next words carefully. And because I didn't want to be the kind of man who stood by and watched. Carter let out a sharp, humorless laugh. A little late for redemption, don't you think? Cale's gaze darkened slightly, but he didn't rise to the bait. Believe whatever you want, he said evenly. But you're not safe yet. Carter narrowed his eyes. And I suppose you're here to warn us out of the goodness of your heart? Cale didn't react immediately. Instead, he looked to Ava, his expression unreadable. You think the High Council was the worst of it? He shook his head. You don't know what's coming. The wind shifted, whipping through the canyons with a low, mournful howl. Ava inhaled slowly, her mind still raw from the failed experiment, from the lingering effects of the neural link. She could still feel Carter at the edges of her consciousness, a presence she hadn't yet learned how to filter out completely. But even without that, something in Cale's voice sent a chill down her spine. What are you talking about? Cale hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Then, finally, he spoke. The High Council wasn't just trying to control you, he said. They were trying to prepare for something bigger. Something they've been keeping hidden. Carter exchanged a glance with Ava. He didn't like where this was going. Cale exhaled, as if bracing himself. There's another force out there. A civilization older than ours. Stronger. And they've been watching. Ava's pulse quickened. Watching? Cale nodded. Waiting. The High Council knew about them. That's why they were so desperate to keep order. Because they knew if their system cracked, if their people became fragmented, Sirith 7 wouldn't survive what's coming next. Carter swore under his breath. You're telling me we just went through all of this, only to be thrown into another fight? Kyle met his gaze, his expression grim. You didn't escape. You just stepped onto a much bigger battlefield. Ava felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. She had spent her entire life searching for a sense of belonging, for a place where she wasn't just an anomaly to be studied or discarded. And now, when she had finally found someone who saw her as more than just an outcast, when she had finally broken free of the chains that had bound her since birth, she had walked straight into another war. Carter ran a hand through his hair, letting out a slow exhale. Fantastic. And here I was hoping for some peace and quiet. Ava almost smiled. Almost. Cale took a step back, his gaze steady. You have a choice, he said. Run. Disappear. Pretend none of this exists. He paused. Or find out the truth. Carter turned to Ava, waiting. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It hadn't been for a while. Ava lifted her gaze to the storm-filled sky, the distant flashes of energy painting streaks of light across the darkness. There was no safety in running, no escape from the reality of what they had uncovered. The High Council had tried to erase her, tried to silence her. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She met Carter's eyes, her decision already made. This isn't over, she said softly. And somewhere, in the depths of the unknown, something watched and waited. The wind howled across the unfamiliar landscape, carrying the scent of charged energy and distant storms. The ground beneath them was foreign, smooth yet fractured, as if the planet itself had been shaped by forces neither of them could begin to understand. A sky of swirling indigo and violet stretched above them, illuminated by streaks of light that arced across the atmosphere like silent warnings. It was a world untouched by the High Council, by the rigid order of Sirith 7. But it was no safer. Ava sat with her back against a jagged rock formation, her body aching, her breathing shallow. The wound beneath her ribs still pulsed with sharp, insistent pain. A cruel reminder of how close she had come to not making it through the portal at all. Her suit was torn, the fabric soaked with blood that had long since dried against her skin. But it wasn't the injury itself that weighed on her. It was the uncertainty. They had escaped, but they had not won. Carter crouched beside her, his expression unreadable, but she could feel the weight of his concern pressing against her, even without the remnants of their fractured connection still lingering between them. He had been quiet since Cale's warning, since the truth about the High Council's secrecy had unraveled before them. It wasn't just about their survival anymore. The fight was far from over. Carter's gaze dropped to her wound, his lips pressing into a thin line. "This needs to be treated," he muttered, his voice edged with frustration. "I don't know what the hell kind of infections exist on this rock, but I'd rather not find out." Ava exhaled slowly, tilting her head slightly to meet his eyes. "We don't have supplies. You know that." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into the utility pack strapped to his belt, pulling out a thin strip of fabric that had once been part of his own undershirt. It wasn't much, but it was clean. Or at least, clean enough. Without a word, he pressed the makeshift bandage against her side, his touch gentler than she expected. The sensation sent a strange warmth through her, something that had nothing to do with the injury. She watched him work, the way his jaw tightened in concentration, the way his hands were careful despite the urgency in his movements. "I should have gotten us out sooner," he muttered under his breath, almost as if he was talking to himself. "Should have planned better. We shouldn't have been forced through like that." Ava frowned. "Carter." His hands stilled against her skin. When he looked at her, there was something raw in his gaze, something she hadn't seen before. "I won't let it happen again," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I won't let them touch you. I won't let you get hurt like this again." Ava wasn't sure what to say to that. For so long she had fought to prove that she could stand on her own, that she didn't need saving, that she wasn't weak, despite what the Council had spent her entire life making her believe. But this wasn't about weakness. It wasn't about control. It was about the simple, undeniable fact that for the first time, she wasn't facing the fight alone. She reached up, her fingers brushing against his wrist. "You can't promise that." Carter let out a short breath, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't quite resignation either. "Doesn't mean I won't try." Ava felt something settle in her chest, something she hadn't realized had been in turmoil until now. Trust. The silence stretched between them, heavy, but not uncomfortable. The weight of everything that had happened, everything that was still to come, lingered in the air around them. They were fugitives, running from a force far greater than themselves, with no allies, no resources, and no clear plan beyond surviving the next few hours. But none of that seemed to matter in this moment. Because here, under this unfamiliar sky, she wasn't just the outcast, and he wasn't just the rogue pilot who had stumbled into a war he hadn't asked for. They were something else, something more. Carter finally sat back, running a hand through his disheveled hair before glancing up at the sky. "You think Cale was telling the truth?" Ava considered the question. There had been no hesitation in Cale's voice when he had warned them. No attempt to manipulate or twist the truth to his advantage. And that was what unsettled her the most. The High Council had always ruled with absolute certainty, convinced of their superiority, their control. But if what Cale had said was true, if there was something else out there, something greater than the Council itself, then everything she had believed about her world, about the fight she had just escaped, was only a fraction of the real battle to come. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I think we're going to find out." Carter let out a slow exhale, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer before he nodded. "Yeah," he said. "I think so too." They sat there in silence for a while, letting the wind carry away the echoes of everything that had come before. The weight of the unknown pressed down on them, but it was no longer suffocating. Because this time, they weren't standing on opposite sides of an unbridgeable divide. This time, they were in it together. Ava tilted her head back, watching the unfamiliar constellations burn against the endless night. Carter shifted beside her, his voice quieter now, softer. "So what's next, Kellen?" Ava let her eyes close for just a moment, allowing herself the smallest reprieve before answering. "We fight," she said. And for the first time, it didn't feel like she was fighting alone. Across the galaxies, across time itself. "You've found your way here. Where are you watching from?" Drop your location in the comments. Let's see how far across the universe our community reaches. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because tomorrow's episode will take you even deeper into the unknown. You won't want to miss it.